Welcome to today's video. Today we're going to talk about the DOM, or the Document Object Model. So the much talked about DOM, and we'll discuss that today. So to begin with, let's define what it is. And the DOM is really a very important construct in working with web applications, because the DOM defines the page, the structure of a web page, into a hierarchical tree-like object. It provides an API, and we're going to talk about that API today, and using JavaScript in order to access that API to allow us to access the DOM, manipulate it, add elements, add nodes, remove nodes, modify those nodes. This is what gives us the ability to make our pages dynamic. And so the reason that we're talking about it now is that we had to talk about JavaScript, we had to talk about HTML, we had to talk about CSS, all those components before we could really make good sense or good use of the DOM. API is an application programming interface. We've talked a little bit about those so far. We'll see that the functions that this DOM provides through its API to allow us to access those elements. You can see that the window here to the right, this little inset screenshot, shows us the hierarchy. And for the sake of time, we're going to focus primarily on the document object. All of these things represent objects. Everything's an object. We have a hierarchical relationship, and that everything starts with the window object. Window has history, location, and then there's document. And so we're going to focus most of our time on the document, because the document is where all the elements go that make up the page, the structure, the thing that our users or our clients see. And so that's what we're going to focus on. Here's an example from the W3, and we looked at the DOM elements, and I've been talking about how that when we structure this, and this is actually kind of a bad example of the structure, that when we create elements, elements can be nested, and that when we nest those elements, and we can see that here, we're going to look at the sample code in a little bit, that as I nest those elements, I like to maintain that indentation so that it's very clear when I'm looking at this code as the developer. This is the only reason this matters, is as the developer, I can look at this code and I can see that hierarchical relationship. This input element has siblings, right? Two other input elements. They have a parent. All three of them have a parent. That parent is this div. This div has a parent. That's main. This main has a parent. That's body. Main has siblings, header and footer. Right? So we're defining this relationship, and we're looking at this through that context, through what is the parent, what are the children, what are the siblings, and so forth. Right? So this does that. Okay? The notation is only beneficial for us as the developer. To the browser, it doesn't matter, because the browser will see this and parse it regardless of the spacing that's provided. By and large, the browser ignores multiple white spaces and treats it as one. How is this then parsed into a DOM tree? Well, that would be very similar to this process right here, or this tree structure right here. We have a table element. You can see the opening and closing. We have a child element to the table element. So this T body. Table body then has two children elements, these table rows, right here and right here. Each table row then has a series of TDs, or table datas, and this defines a table structure. You can think of a table structure as kind of like a grid. Inside of the table data, the TDs are content, and those are actually considered nodes in the context of the DOM. And so how does this look like as a tree? Well, there's our parentmost element. There's that next child element that has two TRs. Inside of each TR, they have two TDs, and each TD has its own content nodes. Right? So that's how that tree would look. Here's another example. Going instead of from the top down, going from the left to the right, you can see here's our window object. Window has children objects, history, location, and document. And again, we're going to focus most of our efforts here on document, the document object, because that defines, as you can see here, all the stuff that makes up our web pages. Location and history, and those are important, but we're not going to spend too much time on those. Inside of this document then, we could see that there is a heading, a paragraph, a heading, and an anchor, and then each one of those nodes or elements has its own set of children nodes. And so through this relationship, through this hierarchy, we have the ability. We looked at it a little bit with CSS, right? We create rules, we write selectors that select based off of this relationship, or can select based off of this relationship. And we'll do the same thing with JavaScript. We'll be able to write selectors that select, let's say that we wanted to change all of the text nodes in the first heading element. Right? Well, we could write CSS, we could write JavaScript that would access through the document, through this heading, this text node. right, and ignore these other tech nodes because they have a different parent. Right, the DOM model's objects, right? It's not only the objects, but also their structure and their relationship. We have events, we have properties, we have methods, and those are the things that we're going to talk about. Of course, it's important to understand that there is some history behind the DOM, and that has an impact on us as developers because we have to understand what DOM that we're supporting. I'm not going to go too far into the history of it because I don't think it's necessarily important for us at this point, but it started with the IE DOM, and they've been through several iterations. We're currently on the HTML5 DOM, and how you define that is inside of your document. When you're looking at this doc statement, this is what's defining the DOM that we're using, and this is the current standard. It's just HTML. This says to the browser, use HTML5. You're not always going to see this. On some older pages, you're going to see a different doc statement, and I'm just going to check because I forgot now, but I don't think USD has, I think it's HTML5, but we can check. Yep, so you can see it's an HTML5 doc statement. So it's using the DOM, the HTML5 DOM. There are sites that are out there that use an older statement. So if you don't see HTML there, it's using an older DOM version. That's what that means. Okay, it's old. Causes compatibility, and so what you have to ask yourself is what type of browsers are you targeting? If you're targeting users of modern browsers, then you can use HTML5. If your users for some reason are significant enough, they're using an older version, an older browser that doesn't support the HTML5 DOM, then you've got a problem, and that's why you need to care. So you do need to be cognizant of pretty much the browsers that you're supporting. Talked about the organization. It's a hierarchy. It's an object tree. Window is the topmost object in that hierarchy, and that represents the browser window. There are other objects. We have the document, we have the history, we have frames, we have browser. Some of these objects, most of these objects we're not going to talk about because we're going to focus on the document one, but they are important, and some of the resources that I've provided for you to read will give you the opportunity to study those in a little more detail. Accessing the DOM is the primary thing that we want to do to make our applications dynamic on the client side, to make them change based off of user interaction. And users, I know for myself included, and most of the people I work with, our users have very high expectations for the functionality of our web application. We've evolved over the last few years from installing software on our machines and running that software to almost, at least for me, I almost run almost everything exclusively out of the browser. I have several browser windows open, I have multiple tabs, I have tab groups. I expect my web applications to do a very wide variety of things. And understanding the DOM and how we access and manipulate that is at the core of providing that dynamic experience. And so that's what we're starting. That's what we're talking about this. And some of the examples that we're going through are relatively trivial, and that we're not really doing anything cool with them because I want to make sure that we're focused on understanding the basics before we go to that next level, or before you go to that next level, which would more than likely be in a more advanced web development class or as a professional working in the field. So let's see, we have a variety of APIs, a variety of functions that we're going to look at today that will give us the ability to access objects or nodes or those elements in the DOM tree and then manipulate. We have a variety of high-level objects, and you can see there's a window, there's a document. Document's the one we're going to focus on, document.body, events, history, location, navigator, and the screen. And all of these correlate to a different thing in the browser. Navigator is the browser, location is the URL in the URL bar. You can change that if you get redirects, just because the application is accessing this location object and changing the value of the URL. History, you can get history of the sites that the browser has been to. Events are going to be big. We're not going to necessarily use this event object. We're going to use event properties on our other objects, but events are big because we've talked about how JavaScript is by and large an event-driven. Websites are by and large an event-driven application. Okay, there is a hierarchy of objects, and so if you start to work with some of the other objects, it's going to be important to understand this hierarchy. That is, if we have, let's say that I want to get to the body being this object in the DOM, how do I get there? Well, technically, because of this, we'll go back a little bit here, because of this hierarchy, it's window.document.body, right? So its parent is a document, the document object, and its parent is the window object. And so if we wanted to reference that body, then we'd say window.document.body, and that would trace through the DOM tree down to that body element. We don't have to do that, though, fortunately. The browser JavaScript assumes window when working with document. And so what you're going to see in a lot of your code is not window.document.body. You're going to see just document standalone, document as an object. And scroll back one more time to this tree. That represents this object right here. Document is the parent object for all the stuff in our web page, all the elements in our web page, right? And it's nice that we can just, the JavaScript just assumes that it's the child of the window, right? So let's see. How do we get objects? How do we get nodes? And that's what we're going to spend the last bit of time here together talking about. It's very common to get it's very common to not only want to get one object, but multiple objects. And so all the methods that we're going to talk about have the ability to return a single node, a single object, a single element, or a collection of. If we get a collection of, then we have an array. And so we'll go through some examples of going through those arrays or those collections of objects. A collection of objects, it just means you have an array of objects. Instead of those array types being something simple like a string or a numeric value, it's a collection of objects. You can get all the forms. And I know we haven't talked about forms. Forms are specific elements in a page that define input elements that get sent. That's the way that we send information back to the server. And so if you wanted to get all the forms from a page, because pages can define multiple forms, then you could say document.forms. Right? We didn't have to say window.document.forms, we just say document.forms, and that'll give us all of the forms on that page. That'll give us a collection of objects, an array of objects, array of forms. From there, right, and this would be more what we're talking about, var forms equals document.forms. We just simply then treat it like an array. And if we wanted to get the first form object, we'd say forms subscript 0. If we want to get the second, we'd say forms index 1, and so forth. Okay, and that's good, that's cool, but now we want to use our API calls, or these functions, to be able to get precisely the objects or the nodes in the DOM that we want to work with. And so we have a variety of them to deal with or to work with here. Object.getElement by tag name, that's kind of the generic implementation. What you'll see most commonly in all of our examples, because I mentioned we're going to be working just almost exclusively with the document object, you're going to see document.getElements by tag name. Right, and this gives us the ability to select all of the nodes in the DOM tree based off of this value that we put in here, by whatever tag name we put in here. So if I put a paragraph tag, then this function call will return all elements that are a paragraph in the DOM. And that gives me those objects, and then I can do things with them. I can change the content, I can change properties, I can change, add event handlers, add the on-click event, whatever I want to do. This gives us the tag. This is a collection. So how do you get the tags? Well, this is a collection of objects. This is an array. All right, and we'll go through some examples. We can get by class name. All right, we talked a little bit about classes with style sheets, and that classes are defined. The rule is a dot, and then we apply those with the class attribute on an element. And so very frequently you'll see that we'll write JavaScript to access the elements based off of the class name. And so all we put inside of here, just like we did with the tag name, a string value with the tag name, we do a string value with the class name as well. We can get select objects based off of ID or name attribute. And so we can say object.getElement by ID or document.getElement by name. And this changes how it selects based off of that attribute. ID is the ID attribute, name is by the name attribute. And note the capitalization, right? It's camel casing, lowercase g, uppercase E, uppercase B, uppercase I, lowercase d. This value then has a string value, and it will get based off of that attribute, ID attribute, name attribute, right? This returns a single object and not a collection. And so there are some differences here, and that when we get element by ID, well, technically get element by ID we can return a collection, but your ID attribute should be unique per object, and so in fact it should only return a single object. Okay, there's a couple more, and these are very powerful. And you'll start to see one of the things you want to start to pay attention to. We're going to talk about jQuery shortly, pretty soon. And jQuery, the whole foundation of jQuery is this really nice selector syntax that gives us the ability to select elements and then do something to them. Modify the properties, modify events, whatever we want to do. And JavaScript has come a long way. jQuery originally kind of grew out of this need to standardize some of these API calls because we didn't have a more standardized HTML5 Dom. We had browsers kind of doing their own thing, and so there was a lot of inconsistencies. And so jQuery provided us with better consistency across the board. We have now in the HTML5 Dom Query Selector All and Query Selector. And this gives us natively, using native JavaScript, a very powerful way to select objects based off of these selectors, and these selectors are going to look almost identical to the CSS selectors that we're using. What you want to ask yourself then is, do I need jQuery? Do I need to include a library like jQuery if I can write it using native JavaScript? And so just kind of tuck that in the back of your head, and as we start looking at jQuery and as you start developing more with web applications, keep that in mind. The difference between these two, right? Query Selector All will return a collection of objects, and Query Selector will simply return the first object in the DOM that the Query Selector finds. So this is going to return a single object, this is going to return a collection, and you can kind of keep that straight in your head. Query Selector All give us all objects, and nothing giving us a single object. Alright, so let's take a look at some of those examples. I've uploaded a source code, or a sample code, into our sample code folder under HTML for DOM intro. This file will look about like this. Okay, so basic HTML structure here. Here's our head. I've defined some styles here just to give the page a little bit more of a nicer layout, although it's a really, really basic page. This is a review. This is the definition of a class. So the only way that these properties are applied to an element is if I define the class attribute on that element. This will apply to paragraph tags that have a parent element of footer, changes the font size. This will apply to paragraph tags that have a parent element with an ID attribute equal to content. Right? So we use the hashtag to identify in our selector when we want to match this to an ID attribute. Okay, here's our script. We'll spend some time in the script section here. We've been talking about JavaScript, so hopefully everything here looks more or less clear to what it's doing. And what I've defined is a handful of functions that will call in here to modify the DOM. Just double check my time. Okay, we're looking pretty good. Right, and then here's our structure. And we already looked at this a little bit. Header with an H1. Main with a div and a series of buttons. These buttons will have these on-click events defined. We have a div name attribute, ID attribute. Okay, so there's the difference between the two. Again, though, general rule, and there's nothing that enforces it but us, we like to use unique values for our ID attributes. That is, that if I have an ID attribute equal to content, this element is the only element that will have that value for that attribute on this page. Okay, this content then, there's a header, there's some more paragraphs. Here's a footer. This is where we define that class. Okay, so we have a class up here, dot, and then class name, sets the color to blue, the for color to blue, and then we apply that class to this element here. And let's see here, this is what this page looks like without any modifications to it. Alright, so there's our buttons, there's those areas, here's the footer with that class being applied. Oops. Alright, so let's see. Before we get into, I guess I want to cover just a little bit more before we go back to this file. So, content, I mentioned when we talked about the DOM tree that content is also part of the DOM or the DOM hierarchy. That is that the content itself, and we can scroll back in these slides here to the beginning. And this is a good example, right? Shady Grove. So this is the content inside of this element. It's not it's not an element itself. It doesn't use a tag name, but it is considered a node in the DOM tree. And so with that being a node, we can access it, we can manipulate it, we can remove it, we can modify it, we can do whatever we need. each object has properties and events, right? And if you go to this URL, which I have open here, you can see that this defines, and this is a great resource, w3schools.com. This talks a little bit about DOM nodes and that element object, the browsers that supported, all the majors, and then this is properties and methods that all HTML elements can use. Right, and so you can start to go through here, and you can see that it's a very, very extensive list. It takes a while to get all of these kind of straight in your head, which ones that you use and which ones that you won't. There's a lot of them in here that I've never even used in all the years that I've been doing web development. And so again, take some time, take a look at these, read through the property or the method, and look at the associated description. Click. Let's see what else. What else is there? Blur removes focus from an element. Append child adds a new child node to an element as the last child node, right? So you start to use those as you create more dynamic user interfaces. You'll do things like append child, and I believe there's a remove child. Let's see if it is. Remove child. Yep, there it is. We have query selector, query selector all, right? So this is where you can go to reference those methods and properties. We have inner HTML and outer HTML, and we'll take a look at that. Those two elements here in this document. Actually, I don't. So, oh yeah, I do. All right, so we'll take a look at that here with that function in just a few moments. Events, and we talked a little bit about events, and when we started talking about JavaScript, events are big because our programs, our websites are by and large event driven. OnClick is one that we use to handle mouse clicks, and again, here's a list of DOM events, and as you can see, we can go to this page and we can look at this as a reference. There are quite a few events. Okay, a very, very large page. And this does a really good job of basing or grouping the events by the type. So we have mouse events like click. It's an event that's triggered through the mouse. The mouse goes over some element. The mouse moves on an element. The mouse leaves an element. Keyboard events. The key is pressed up. The key is pressed down. The key is pressed. We have form events. You submit a form. On blur, on focus. We talked about those. Drag events, more UI-based events, right? So there's a ton of things here and to study, and so we're barely even, I could barely even say scratching the surface because there's so many events to study and use, but we got to start somewhere. So those are a list of events. Remember that OnClick is supported by more than just button events. And then there's also JavaScript supports dialog boxes, alerts, confirms, and prompts. We looked at alert, confirm, and prompt are just a couple of different types that are very seldomly used. Events are a critical part of a page, and you saw that they're so critical just simply by the length, the number of events that we'll have. We write our own functions to react to certain events. Right? So recall that we have events and we have event handlers. And so because objects have different events, then we can define how we want to handle those events. We can say something like object.onClick equals function. Object.onClick, that is our event, and the callback, or the event handler, which is the function that we're going to call. We're going to start with the onload function, and so that gets us through all the slides I wanted to cover. We're going to start with the onload function, and the onload function is very typical for when the page is loaded, right? And one of the most important things to, or one of the, I wouldn't say the most important, but something very important to understand when we first start talking about the DOM is that the page begins, and we've mentioned this, I mentioned this in the past, that as the page begins the process, it starts at the top and it starts understanding or building this DOM tree as it goes. We get into the head section, we define titles and styles and scripts, and we start looking at functions and any sort of code. Before we get to the head and the body and so forth. And so if you start doing things dynamically in the head section, let's say that you start writing JavaScript that modifies your DOM tree, you can't modify that DOM tree until it's built. I can't have JavaScript up here that references elements down here until those elements have been defined in the tree before the page is loaded and the DOM has been completely parsed. And so one way that we can ensure that we don't call any code, any JavaScript, until we have a DOM tree, a fully complete DOM tree, is on the window.onload event. So you can say that once it's done, this is an event that the browser triggers to say, okay, I'm done parsing, now you can do something. We can say once the DOM is done, we can call some initialization code. And so we can say something like window.onload equals initialize. Or you might see it in the body tag. You might see the onload attribute defined on the body tag to the same thing, right? This would be very equivalent. And so we have it, once we have that event trigger or fire, then it's safe to start to manipulate the DOM, right? So we say window.onload equals initialize, and here's our function initialize, right? So as this page loads, recall we have functions, and functions, the code is not executed until a function is called. So all this code is defined in a function, and we don't call any of it until the onload event fires, in which case we call initialize. Right now, all initialize does is pops an alert box that says ready, and I think you already saw that here when I refresh this page, right? Ready. Right, the DOM is ready, that event fired, we called that code. Okay, well, that's kind of boring. So we can do things. We can say something like window.document.getElement by ID, and we can get an element that has an ID attribute equal to p_content. And so if we scroll down back to our page, we can see that here is a paragraph with an ID attribute that is equal to p_content. And so we're going to access that element via JavaScript, and we're going to use the inner HTML property to append a new paragraph to it, to append additional content to that content node. Right? So now we'll save those changes, and we'll refresh this page, and here we have, here's our body, right, and there's our new content. Okay. Now you'll see that I have the reason why this looks a little bit weird is that I've defined some styles, width and height, and so it just didn't come out looking too well there. But that's okay, right? Because I'm not going to leave that in there anyway. But selected an object, document.getElement by ID. So we use that API call. We used the ID, the value of the ID attribute, and we modified that inner HTML. We did a plus equal, right? So that added to the value that was originally there. If I just do an equal, then that'll replace that value. Right? New content. Right? So got rid of the old, replaced it with something new. Right? So there's a difference between assignment assigns a new value, and plus equals, which is like concatenation. It's saying take the value that was already there and add the new value to it. Right? So if we go back in here, you'll see that we'll have that kind of mangled body with new content. Okay, window, that's not necessary. And I mentioned that earlier, that when JavaScript, when you use document, it just assumes that you're using window.document. So again, we can go back and refresh and see that still works. Okay, objects have events. Again, both of those links that I provided in the slides talk about those properties and events. This is a property, this is an event. So we can say document.getElement by ID, button color P. So if we go down and we look at our buttons that I've defined, so here's 3 input types, inputs with type is equal to button. For this one, I defined an ID attribute, button color P, BTN COLOR P. We go back up to our initialization code, then we can say, okay, so I want to select that element, and then I want to access this onClick event and say that when that element is clicked, when that button is clicked, I want to call that function. So I say getElement by ID returns a single object. There's the event onClick, and this is the event handler, the by element. Okay. So what does that code do? Well, what it does is we have to look at this function in order to determine that. And here, we're going to use a different query selector. And so what this is going to ultimately do is it's going to select all paragraph in using this selector, and it's going to change their background color to blue. All right, so let's just take a look at that and see how that works. All right, the page loads, we call that initialize function, and when we click this button, we should see that all the paragraph tags background color turns to blue. All right, so how do we do that? Well, we've been using those APIs, we've been using those functions, and now we can use Query Selector All, because Query Selector All is going to give us a collection of objects. We take a selector. This is our selector value. And so in this case, I wanted to change all the paragraphs inside of this section right here. So I have an ID of content, and I have paragraph tags inside of there. And so what that selector does for us then is it says all paragraphs that have a parent with an ID attribute equal to content. That gave us that collection. So that gave us these 4 paragraph tags here. Okay, from there, very similar to that array. We talked about arrays, right? I declare for loop. I start at 0 because I want to iterate over each element in the array. I use I to not only control the number of iterations, but also to access the indexes. I use the length property of this array, and then I increment by 1. So paragraphs is the name of my array, my collection of objects, paragraph at index I, and now I access a couple of different properties, right? So we have the style property, and then within the style property, we have all the different style properties. Background color is one of those. So we can say style.background color equals blue. Another link, and I need to post this one in here because I didn't provide it in the slide deck. This is where it talks about the style. Oops, gotta go back one. This is where it talks about the DOM style object, right? So every element, every object has a style object. And inside of that, we have all these different properties. So again, a very overwhelming list when you're first getting started. And so it can be very, very daunting to figure all of those out. There's, again, I seldomly have to work with the vast majority of these. Background color, background image. If you think about rules and the properties that you write in your CSS, these are the equivalent. This is just our way to access it using the DOM object instead of using CSS. So anything that we would do in CSS, we can do through JavaScript, through the DOM, and we just have to figure out how we would change that, right? If we did this in CSS, background color, I don't think I did it here, we would write the property a little bit different, background-color. And so when we look at it, or we want to access that property via the DOM, via JavaScript, we might have to write something a little bit different. That is, this background with an uppercase C and no dash. Okay. Let's see, is there another one in here? Color, right? Color sets or returns the color of the text. That is the same property as we have here in this class, right? So as you're starting to get more comfortable with CSS, you'll also get more comfortable with this style object and all the properties that are associated with it, because they're pretty much the same thing, right? So that's how this function works. Selects all those elements, changes the style background color property equal to blue, and that's where we get the results here. Okay, so click me, and there we go, they're all blue. Okay, I also have a reset all, and I don't need that console.log. What does this do? Well, in this case, I assign the onClick attribute directly on that button, right? So I said onClick equals reset all. When you do it this way, you do have to include that opening and closing parenthesis. Reset all, here's this function, right? Very similar. Document.querySelectorAll, I'm going to get a collection of objects. Here's my selector. I'm saying this is giving us every single node that's a child of body, which in this case is everything, because everything is a child of body, right? Body is our parentmost tag here. So that gives us all the nodes, very same loop, and all I'm doing now is I'm setting that style.background color equal to initial. How do you know to use the value initial? Well, if you go to a reference like this, and we'll scroll back up to that background property, all of these are hyperlinked. Background color, and if we follow any of these individual properties, we follow that hyperlink, then it gives us information about it. It talks a little bit about it, definition and usage, browser support, syntax, and then property values. So we can use a color, we can use transparent, we can use initial, and we can use inherent. And I set it to initial, which sets the property to its default value. right? If you need to read more about initial, you can follow that hyperlink. And so you do have to be a little bit careful when you're first getting started, and then it's very easy to follow link after link after link, and before you know it, you've got about 15 tabs open because you're reading a lot of information. But it is important, and trust me, it gets a lot easier. So if it feels like there's a lot of stuff to learn here, there is, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And so we're not, obviously we're not going to cover all of it, and that's why I'm showing you these resources to help build your tool set as you're moving forward. So that resets it. And so if we go back to the page, to our DOM demo page, and we click Reset All, that resets everything back to its default. You'll notice there's some unintended consequences there, or side effects perhaps, and that it also resets some of my buttons, but that's all right because it's just a demo. Right, but it did iterate over every element and change that background property to initial. Okay, get rid of our developer tools, and let's see, the last one that I wanted to talk about was by class, right? Because we talked about it, and we're not going to cover all of those elements. I hope you get the idea on how to use these particular API calls. Query Selector All returns a collection. Query Selector returns one object, the first that matches this selector. And so the use is very similar, except that we're getting one instead of a collection of. Get class by name. Right, so that's my function here. I did define that on another input type of button, and so the on-click event is get by class. I did do something a little bit different here, and that is I made this function a little bit more generic, and that it takes an argument, which is the class name. And so we're going to use that as the value in our API call. We're going to say document.getElements by class name, and we'll use the value of this argument. Right, so anything that has a class name based off of whatever value is provided, it'll get that, return a collection of objects. This is another method that returns a collection of objects, stores them in this variable as an array, iterates over this array, and just like we've been doing, changes the background color equal to blue. If we look at this call then, I'm saying colorful. Right, so if I want to provide an argument, a value for that argument, I have to use the function name, and then because I'm using double quotes here, I have to use single quotes here, and so it can get a little bit tricky there if you're not used to that. So this will pass the value of colorful. This will be the value of this argument when that button is clicked, and it'll get all elements that have a class of colorful, which in this case, whoops, too far, is only this class right here. Okay, so we'll go back to our page here. By class name, and there you can see it changed that element. That element, because that was the footer itself, it changed its background color, which included these children elements. Right, so they probably had a transparent background color, so well, they had a foreground color of blue as well, which made them look like they disappeared. Right, and we could reverse that. We could say white, and refresh our page and see what happens. All right, there we go. Okay, if you scroll to the bottom of this page, then there are some additional examples for you to look at. Some examples of using document.getElement by tag name, and then just simply log into the console window the results of going through those collections. I have that all commented out right now. This code, because this code is just going to run, right? None of this code is in a function. And so if we move this script tag up to the head, we'd get a lot of errors. Well, and let's just do that real quick. So let's just move that up here. I'll just add another script tag, and we'll go ahead and we'll run this code. We'll leave our console open though, because when we start doing some debugging, it's important to have the console open because it'll log errors with JavaScript. Okay. Okay, there were no errors. Well, here, let's do this though. Console.log, and run this again, and we got no output though. right? So we didn't get any errors, so I misspoke there, but we didn't get any output either. And why is that? Because we're running this code. We're trying to access the DOM. In this case, we're trying to select all H1 elements, all H1 nodes. We know they exist. We're looking at them. There's at least 3 of them in this page. But because we're running this code before the DOM is fully parsed, then it doesn't select anything. So we didn't get a syntax here. We don't get any errors here, but we didn't get any results either. And so if we take this code and move it to the footer, that will run. The DOM still isn't 100% parsed because we haven't gotten to the last couple of tags, but it's close enough. We know that when this code runs, the DOM of this content here, those nodes will have been parsed by then. Right, and now we see some output because we did that shift. Right, so you can leave stuff in the script tag here at the very bottom of the document, right before body, or if you do indeed want this code to run after the page is loaded, then you'd simply do like we did before, which is to move everything into this initialize function and call that function on the window.onload event. Okay, so anyways, get elements by tag name, loops through that collection. Get elements by class name, loops through that collection. Get element by ID gives us the properties of that particular object, a single object. And so just some examples there for you to look at and make sure. So again, if you have any questions on this, if it seemed like I went too fast or too slow or whatever, I need to know. Let me know your feedback, and let me know if you have any questions, so I can certainly help with that. Otherwise, that is the DOM. Hopefully the DOM, you have a fundamental understanding of how the DOM works and why it's important as a web developer to be able to parse the DOM, because it's how we make our applications dynamic. So with that, that's all I have. I'll stop the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.